would like to step into the topic of youth work, we would like to welcome now Dr. Howard Williamson, Professor of European Youth Policy at the Faculty of Business and Society at the University of South Wales.
He is a youth worker, academic youth researcher, lecturer, and youth policy advisor.
He has been involved in the development of youth work in Europe for an exceptionally long time, and we cannot imagine anyone better to bring us up to date what the needs and prospects of youth work in Europe are. Howard, are you here? Do you hear us?
Well, I am here. I can hear you. I don't know whether you can hear. Yeah?
Howard, we heard your speech has the name Wind in Our Back. We are curious to hear from you what that means.
Okay, well, first of all, good morning and good afternoon, because in some parts of Europe it's already afternoon. And I would remind you, Jenny and Tim, that you may have started early, but I started earlier because I'm 1 hour behind you. Yeah, wind in our back. Well, I stole this expression from a webinar that was part of the MOOC organised by the Youth Partnership. And the term wind in our back was used a few times during that webinar. And I thought it was a sort of apposite title for this short presentation, largely because finally we have a great opportunity to come together to debate the kind of key priorities for youth work in the next 5 years and beyond, and to set the bond process in motion under a European youth work agenda. Now, one of the problems of speaking after distinguished people like Adina and Miriam and Musti and Tommy is that they've already said quite a few things that I was also planning to say. So I've made a few adjustments, and I hope that people listening will treat this as reinforcement rather than repetition when I do cover similar ground. Now, Tommy particularly, but Miriam as well, talked about the community of practice, which is a new kind of terminology that we've been using for a few years. It is, as Tommy rightly said, about our shared commitment and our shared convictions about what youth work is all about. I would point out that this youth work community of practice, embraces a huge range of styles of youth work, from self-governed youth organisations to open youth work to street-based work, project-based work, addressing a whole range of issues from radicalisation to human rights and so on and so forth. So we do have this very, very varied set of approaches to youth work. Adina talked about being in the triangle between policy, research and practice. It was not always like that. And in the last 10 years, we have managed to bring together people from the triangle to work in harmony, not all the time, but at least in collaboration to share ideas and build theory and do research and to develop policy. I think the beautiful thing about the digital convention is that we have the opportunity to bring together, as you both said, 1,000 people or so. Some people like me with a lot of experience and some people who are relatively new to the youth work field. And we need their ideas, their innovative ideas, their creative new ideas. I was at a meeting quite recently when somebody said, we need new blood. And I said, well, I might as well stop talking because I'm rather old blood. But actually, we need both old blood and new blood to take this agenda forward. And the other fantastic thing about the convention is it brings together the wider Europe, from France to Finland, Portugal to Poland, from the Atlantic Sea to the Adriatic Sea, and right across the piece, north to south, east to west, and a huge number of countries with very different experiences and directions in their youth work practice. But we come together at this convention to take that forward. I would also just like to say thank you very much to all the colleagues. You've mentioned them all, Jenny and Tim, already, so I don't need to go through them again. I wasn't planning to anyway, but there's been a vast number of people involved in the planning of this convention, and I would just personally like to say thank you to all of them, because I am aware of what an enormous challenge it has been to turn this from a physical meeting in the conference centre to a virtual meeting as we are having now. Now, the great thing about the experience and expertise that we have at this convention, the community of practice, is that we now have a high level of political support behind the work that we would like to do. And that political support, most recently through the Council conclusions under the German presidency of the European Union, has provided us with a political anchor, a political foundation, a political expression of support to allow us to go forward. And I'll just come back to a comment Miriam made in a moment. So this is a unique moment. It is a moment to be seized. And I will again come back to that later on. But I wanted to start really with a kind of opening personal note remark. You said very kindly that I've been involved in youth work for a very long time. It's actually 52 years. And in 1968, when I was a teenager and set up my own little youth club in my little village, simply because we were a bunch of kids in the park getting cold and we wanted a warm space to hang around in. And that was my first foray into youth work. I had no knowledge of theory or policy about youth work. It was just, we wanted somewhere to go and something to do a couple of evenings a week. And I never imagined for one moment, I could not have imagined that about 52 years on, I would be addressing about 52 countries in Europe, maybe 50, maybe 47, but it's always a bit debatable. But I know that I've got a colleague from Africa who's joining in this convention, so probably is about 52 countries who are involved in this convention in one way or another. And it's a great privilege and a great honour and a great challenge to still be part of this process at this kind of pan-European level, to take forward not only my own personal commitment to open youth work, which is where I started and where I continued as a practitioner for another 30 years or so, but also to recognise and respect all those different forms of youth work that I've already kind of mentioned. And I think my experience remains on the ground. I'm still involved in a lot of local youth projects, supporting them. I'm involved in COVID-19 youth work, and I'm also involved at pretty high levels with the Council of Europe and sometimes with the European Commission and the UN, and so on and so forth. And I write a lot about youth work through my university activities. And I think when I was thinking about what to say, I think of three things that I did as a practitioner when I had students on placement, when I was a kind of fieldwork supervisor. I do it with students that I'm teaching in the university more academically about youth work. I do it in policy-making circles, and I say, think of the three words: maintain, develop, innovate. Maintain, develop, innovate. And it's really about let's maintain and hold on to the things that we've already achieved. Let's develop them further. Let's look critically at what we already do and see where we can take them forward. And let's never rule out that there will be new expressions of youth work as new challenges arise. And I'll come on to that in a moment. Now, those challenges, are with us right now. They're particularly acute because of COVID. But I do want to just go back to the point that Kuhn made about the two conventions. And Miriam talked about we should not see ourselves, we're not the underprivileged in the professional network of human practice, people work as it's sometimes called. And yet in 2010, we really had to rid ourselves of that perception. What we did in 2010, as a number of speakers have already said, was that we celebrated our diversity. But one of the points I made then was that sometimes youth work felt like a dog, a stray dog, running around looking for somebody to feed it and looking for a home. I think we've moved beyond that. We're much more confident about what we do, but not necessarily yet confident enough. We were worried after 2010 that diversity can seem like anything goes. Anything that you do with and for young people counts as youth work. That's not always true. And so we looked for this common ground. And when we look at the organisations, the youth organisations represented by the within the European Youth Forum, for example, and then we look at the open youth work advocated by the European Federation of Youth Clubs, or the street-based work supported by Dynamo, and many other forms of youth work, sometimes it is difficult to feel and find the common ground and feel that we are part of some shared community of practice. But we did that in 2015, and I think since that time, for the last 5 years, we really have worked much more closely together in many, many different respects, and we have secured some level, and I say some level, it's not a complete level, of political support and recognition for the idea of youth work within the EU Youth Strategy, within the Council of Europe Agenda 2030, Youth Sector Agenda 2030. So I really do think that we have what I've written in my notes as a never before opportunity to make something happen. However, and of course there's always a however, particularly when you're an academic, because you never see things as finalized or finished, but there are always challenges. And some of you will have had a look at my contribution to the background papers, the cornerstone challenges for youth work in the 21st century. I would like to pay tribute and credit to my friend and colleague Philip Cousset, who worked with me on the History of Youth Work in Europe series for 10 years and probably formulated some of these challenges and these ideas ahead of me, and we worked together on those things. So we've got these challenges, and I'm not going to go through them all. I don't have time to go through them all, but I'm going to highlight some of them under the 4 kind of key headings that I used to guide my cornerstone challenges, and were also used in the recent council conclusions. So I'm just going to pick a few things out, but the first kind of key heading is conceptualizing youth work. I am not arguing that we need to go round the course again and try and battle over different definitions of youth work, but we do need to have a shared narrative that we can express to the wider world, to the political decision makers, to the private sector, and to other areas of youth policy. We need to keep in balance the different kind of pressures that are on youth work, that it's not the panacea and it's not the solution to youth unemployment, migration, and poor health behaviour by young people. Youth work is, I've always said, it's a modest but very important and significant contribution within and for young people's lives. And of course, that's why we partly have the whole spaces and bridges narrative and agenda that was developed from the 2015 convention. I think we need to look at a lot of youth work in the context of what I would call tension triangles. Philip and I have written about this in the final volume of the History of Youth Work in Europe series, volume 7, where we talk about trilemmas for youth work. One example would be that youth work has always had to navigate between emancipation, regulation, and recreation. We are not, as some people rather maliciously suggest, adolescent childminders. But we are about emancipating young people. We are sometimes called to regulate young people's opportunities and behaviour, hopefully in creative and constructive and purposeful ways. And we are also partly about leisure, young people's leisure time, and they need to have some fun. So it's not about rolling out any of these corners of these triangles. It's more about how do we actually position ourselves within them, and how do we create a story to talk about that is the unique contribution that youth work can make to young people's lives. So that's about concepts. Then we have the whole set of issues about competence. Now, some people are very keen on this word professionalization. I'm cautious about it. Most of our youth work in Europe is guided and governed by volunteers. There are relatively few full-time paid professional, and professionals are a dodgy word anyway, but paid youth workers. And while there should be strong advocacy for equipping youth workers with greater competencies and skills and abilities, we should be very cautious about arguing that it needs to be a kind of graduate profession, because we're a million miles away from that. Nevertheless, we do want youth work to reflect a high degree of professionalism, and that means agreeing certain kinds of standards, perhaps developing codes of practice, and various other issues. Very controversially in the United Kingdom some years ago, 22 years ago, we had a person who killed some children in a school, and he was described in the media as a youth worker. And that led to a lot of anxious debate about whether there should be a license to practice, a license to use the term. But all of these decisions, or all of these ideas, have pluses and minuses attached to them, and I hope that one of the contributions the convention will make will be to identify some of those tensions and frictions and ambivalences between different ways of thinking about what youth work needs to do in terms of strengthening its competence. The fourth key challenge is around credibility. I'm sure I'm speaking to a group of people who, like I do, believe fundamentally that youth work makes a fantastic contribution to young people's lives in myriad ways. But if it was so fantastic, and if it was so clear and evident, there was enormous evidence that this is what youth work did, then we wouldn't have any problems winning political and economic support for it. So we still have a job to do in terms of explaining that non-formal education and learning, within which youth work sits, has what I call a parallel and equivalent contribution to make alongside formal education, and indeed alongside other forms of therapeutic and social intervention in young people's lives. So, and within that whole question of credibility is always that balance to be struck between the focus on young people and the focus on society. And youth work will not be youth work anymore if it gets sucked into simply delivering political agendas for young people, but nor will it achieve a great deal of credibility if it is solely focused on young people's social condition and social circumstances and expressed wishes and needs. The fourth key area is to do with connections. And it's one of the things that COVID has done for us, I think, in some parts of Europe, has demonstrated the agility and flexibility that youth work can produce and provide in relation to mental health, in relation to activities under lockdown situations. And I know that Miriam in Malta, for example, has developed a lot of creative youth work practice that has demonstrated to other parts of youth policy that youth work can play its part and has an important job to do as a partner, not as a subordinate add-on to those practices, but as a partner in those wider youth policy practices. And I think the other point about connections is that we live in a tremendously unequal playing field for youth work. Young people in Europe are in very different places in terms of their access to youth work opportunities. Young people in rural areas have a very different story to tell about access to youth work from those in urban areas. we talk about a community of practice, we celebrate a community of practice, but even our different constituent parts of our community practice operate in very, very different kind of conditions of pay and security and partnership and association. So we need to think about how we might strengthen that. Just two more things. One is the COVID crisis has obviously produced the need to go digital, possibly faster than most youth workers would have imagined, except those in Finland and Estonia, who pioneered this stuff and promoted it. But I think we have to remember that the digital approach to youth work is yet another valuable tool, a valuable mechanism, but it's not a replacement for other forms of youth work, and that youth work needs to constantly remind itself that it rests on core values. These are enshrined in the Council of Europe's recommendation: educational, empowering, participative, expressive, and inclusive are five of, and I'm sure there are more, but those are five core values. And we have to ensure that we operate our youth work practice in relation to those values, whether it's digital, on the street, or in a building, or in some other way. Right, to conclude, we do have this rare, special, and probably not repeatable opportunity under Germany's presidency of the European Union and its chairmanship of the Committee of Ministers of the Council of Europe. And this is our opportunity to seize the moment. It's time for us to put some flesh on the bones of a European youth work agenda. It's time for us to anchor youth work more firmly within broader youth policy frameworks. Time, I think, is a critical word. Some of you will know of my youth policy clock, where I talk about there is time for dissent and debate and argument and clarification, but eventually that that dissent needs to come to a halt, and we have to look at shared paths for development and direction. And only through doing that will we sustain the kind of political support that has hitherto, in the last few years, provided the wind in our back. If we don't act, then we are failing our young people. We've got many, many documents. We did not have many 10 years ago. We've now got a vast amount of paperwork, and we will have more, setting the Bonn process in motion. But the acid test of all of this will be whether we really do strengthen youth work on the ground, which is what young people in Europe demand and deserve. I think that's probably it. I think I will finish off with an attempt to paraphrase President Kennedy. I think no longer should we be requesting the European institutions, the Commission, the Council of Europe, the partnership between them, to do something for us. We have to ask what we can do for ourselves. And I hope that the convention by Thursday will provide the drafting group with the material, the ammunition, the firepower to take forward the Bonn process within the European Youth Work Agenda. Good luck to everybody, my friends, colleagues, and those I've not yet met. I feel very privileged to have been able to say these few words to you, and I hope you have a challenging, enjoyable, and constructive few days. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Howard, for this very inspiring speech. But I need to make one point in the very beginning. You said it's earlier for you, even earlier than it is for us. I just had a look at your, if you can see at your picture, you have a clock in the background. It says 10 minutes after 3. I hope your clock is lying and it's not that early for you, because 10 minutes after 3 would be very early.
It's also the wrong way round. So the clock. So I forgot about that clock. Yeah.
Right, it's also flipped. Right. Right, that's the interesting stuff of video conference backgrounds.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Howard. It was very interesting to learn about the current challenges of youth work in Europe, but also the opportunities that come with the new European youth work agenda.